Back of the line. First class is boarding now. This isn't your section." The words came out flat. No apology behind them, no question mark at the end, just a wall. Dominique Harlow stopped walking. She turned slowly toward the man in the blue vest standing at the jet bridge entrance. His name tag read Frank DeLuca, Senior Gate, Supervisor Apex Airways. He had his arms crossed, his chin tilted up slightly the way people tilt their chin when they've already decided something before the other person opens their mouth. She held up her boarding pass. Calm, steady, the way you hold up evidence. Frank glanced at it, then at her, then back at it. "Where'd you get this? I purchased it," Dominique said. "Seat 3A, same as printed. 3A is first class." "Yes." "I know." Frank leaned forward slightly. Not enough to be aggressive, just enough to be certain. His voice dropped just below the noise of the terminal, but not so low that the people standing nearby couldn't hear if they were paying attention. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 19 years. I know what a first-class passenger looks like." He paused. "You're going to need to step aside." 200 people stood behind her in the boarding line. 200 people heard those words or heard enough of them. Some looked away. Some looked directly at her. Some reached for their phones without yet knowing why. Dominique Harlow said nothing. She could end this in one sentence. 10 words would be more than sufficient. She knew exactly what those words were. She had thought about them since the moment this man opened his mouth. She could say, "I am the person who decides whether your airline survives the next 2 years." She didn't say them. She wanted to see what they would do when they believed no one important was watching. She wanted to see who they really were when the stakes felt low to them. When she was just a woman in a navy blazer with a worn leather bag and no logo on anything she was wearing. She wanted the truth, not the performance. They were about to give her both. Before we go any further, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next made national headlines. Stay with me. 5:10 in the morning. Dominique Harlow's condominium. Charlotte, North Carolina. The coffee maker didn't make a sound because Dominique didn't use the coffee maker. She used the same French press she had owned since her second year at Howard University, when she lived in a studio apartment the size of a parking space and borrowed a hot plate from her neighbor Rosa to heat the water. The French press had been a birthday gift from her mother. $12 at a discount store. The rubber grip around the handle had cracked and been wrapped in electrical tape twice since then. Dominique could buy the entire coffee company now if she wanted to. She still used the French press every single morning. Some habits remind you where you started. Some habits are the whole point. She pressed the plunger down slowly, watching the ground settle, and set the first cup on the granite counter to cool slightly before she touched it. Then she looked at her wrist. The watch. It was gold-plated, or had been once many years ago. The plating had worn through in several places, showing the silver-toned metal underneath. The crystal face was scratched in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, like a map of a city nobody had named yet. The leather strap had been replaced twice. The mechanism inside still kept perfect time. Her mother, Lorraine Harlow, had worn this watch for 38 years as a registered nurse at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. Night shifts, double shifts, holiday shifts when every other nurse had traded away to be home with their families. Lorraine never traded. Not because she didn't want to be home, because somebody had to stay and Lorraine Harlow believed that somebody should be her. Dominique had watched her mother fasten that watch every morning before a shift. Watched her unfasten it every morning when she came home. Sometimes Lorraine came home and sat down at the kitchen table without taking her coat off and just breathed for a few minutes. Dominique had learned to give her those minutes without asking anything. The watch had been on Dominique's wrist since the day of the funeral 3 years ago. She had fastened it herself at the graveside. She had not taken it off since except to shower. It did not match anything she owned. She did not care. She carried her coffee to the kitchen counter, set it beside her laptop, and opened the screen. Her calendar showed one item for today's Charlotte to Washington, D.C. Apex Airways flight, 1:14:27:15 a.m. depart. She opened the file she had been reviewing for 6 days. Apex Airways, Federal Infrastructure. Loan application. Amount requested $4.8 billion. Purpose, fleet modernization, route restructuring, debt refinancing. Internal review deadline, 14 days. Dominique read the executive summary with the kind of attention most people reserve for something they are afraid of. Because federal loan decisions of this size deserved exactly that. Fear of making the wrong call. Fear of the families behind every number. The fleet situation was serious. Apex's aircraft averaged 21 years in operation. Maintenance costs had climbed 34% in 3 fiscal years. Fuel efficiency lagged significantly behind competitors that had modernized in the past decade. The airline had already triggered one debt covenant breach with its primary lenders last quarter. A credit rating downgrade from Moody's was being discussed internally, according to documents submitted with the application. Without this federal funding, the airline was looking at financial distress within 18 months. Bankruptcy was not a distant possibility. It was a probability with a timeline attached. 11,000 employees. 41 cities in the route network. Many of them smaller markets that larger carriers had abandoned as unprofitable years ago. Pension obligations for thousands of retirees who had spent decades loading baggage in the rain, pushing wheelchairs through terminal corridors at midnight, working the counter during weather delays when passengers screamed at them for things nobody could control. Dominique made a note in the file margin, verify fleet age data independently. Review operational complaint records Thursday. Final decision by close of business day 14. She closed the laptop, finished her coffee, and went to change her clothes. Her assistant Nia had asked her once about a year ago why she still flew commercial on domestic evaluation trips, when the agency budget covered first class and private charter was available for travel deemed mission critical. Dominique had given her the answer she gave every time anyone asked. That's how I evaluate an airline before I sign off on their money. I want to see how they treat ordinary passengers, the ones who don't have connections, the ones they don't think matter, the ones they're not performing for. That tells me everything I need to know about the actual culture of the company, everything I can't learn from a financial filing. Nia had nodded and never asked again. This morning, Dominique was flying Apex Airways, Charlotte to Washington Reagan National, the exact carrier whose loan application sat open in her review queue with 14 days left on the clock. She had purchased her seat with her personal credit card. No corporate account. No special request. No advance notification to the airline. If they know I'm watching, they perform. She had said it so many times it had become a kind of professional creed. I want to see the truth. I want to see who they are when they think nobody important is looking. She picked up her worn leather bag, checked that the Apex file was saved, fastened the watch, walked to the door. In 14 days, she would decide whether Apex Airways received $4.8 billion in federal money or face the consequences of not receiving it. This morning, Apex Airways was going to show her something she had not put into any of her financial models. They were going to show her exactly who they were. 6:35 in the morning. Charlotte Douglas International Airport. Gate C-22. Apex Airways. Frank DeLuca had been at this gate since 5:50 a.m. He was always early. He considered earliness a professional virtue, one of the things that had kept him employed at Apex for 19 years while other people had come and gone. He started as a part-time ramp agent right out of high school, worked his way through every position the ground operations department had to offer, and arrived at senior gate supervisor with the quiet conviction of a man who believed he had earned his authority fair and square. The badge said so. Senior Gate Supervisor Apex Airways. He touched it sometimes without meaning to the way people touch things they are proud of. Frank had a system. He would stand at the podium during boarding and run his eyes down the line of waiting passengers the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood before cutting it. Assessing, categorizing, making quick determinations based on experience. He would have told you, if you asked him, that his system was about efficiency, about moving people onto the aircraft quickly and without complications, about protecting the operation. He would have believed what he was telling you. What the system actually was something Frank had never examined closely enough to name. It lived in the space between what he noticed and what he decided to do about what he noticed. It operated on a set of signals he had never written down and never been asked to explain out loud. Signals about presentation, about clothing, about the kind of quiet confidence that certain people carried and certain other people in Frank's 19 years of experience did not. At 6:47, the first-class boarding call went out over the gate speakers. Frank positioned himself at the entrance to the jet bridge and began to scan the line. A man in a charcoal suit. Fine. A woman in business, casual with a rolling carry-on bearing a corporate logo. Fine. Two men traveling together both in pressed shirts. Fine. A woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, holding a leather portfolio. Fine. Then his eyes landed on Dominique Harlow. Navy blazer, simple cut, no brand visible. Dark jeans, leather bag worn at the handles. No jewelry except a watch on her left wrist that caught the terminal light briefly, gold-toned, old-looking. No rolling luggage, no companion. She stood in line with the specific stillness of someone who had stood in a great many lines in her life and had learned not to waste energy on impatience. Frank's eyes moved past her to the man in the blue tie behind her. Then they came back. They stopped. Something about the picture didn't match the frame Frank had built for it over 19 years. He couldn't have said what exactly. He would not say what later when he was asked to say it precisely and clearly. He stepped away from the podium and moved toward the head of the line. The boarding pass scanner had already done its job. The machine beeped once solid and green when Dominique held her pass to the reader. Valid ticket. Seat 3A, first class. Everything in order. She took 3 steps onto the jet bridge. "Ma'am, stop right there." She turned around. Frank DeLuca had followed her onto the jet bridge. He stood 3 feet behind her with one hand raised palm forward, the universal gesture for halt. "Can I see your boarding pass again, please?" She held it out without a word. He took it. Studied it. Not a quick glance the way gate agents typically re-examine a pass they've already scanned. He studied it the way someone studies a document they are hoping to find something wrong with. His eyes moved from the pass to her face and back to the pass. He turned it slightly as though checking whether the paper itself was genuine. "This ticket says 3A. That's correct. That's first-class seating." "Yes, I know." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a frown. The kind of look that has already arrived at a conclusion and is now looking for language to support it. "Do you have identification with you?" She reached into her blazer pocket and produced her driver's license. He took it with 2 fingers, held both documents side by side, and compared the name letter by letter. He compared the photograph to her face with a deliberateness that was starting to become its own kind of statement. "There appears to be a discrepancy here." He handed the documents back without explaining what the discrepancy was. "I need you to step aside, please. To the bench, I'm going to call for additional assistance." Dominique looked at him, steady, not angry, not confused. She had the expression of someone who has been shown a card trick they recognize the mechanics of. What discrepancy exactly? He did not answer the question. He was already reaching for the radio on his belt. "The bench, ma'am." She walked to the metal bench bolted to the wall of the jet bridge, sat down, set her bag on the seat beside her, crossed her ankles, placed her hands in her lap. Her back was completely straight. Behind her, through the open door of the jet bridge, the boarding line had gone still. 200 passengers were watching. Some had stopped moving without quite deciding to. Some were already reaching for phones. Margaret Okafor, everyone called her Peggy, and had for 40 years, stood fourth in line. She was 69 years old, white-haired, small, in build a retired elementary school teacher from Raleigh, who was flying this morning to visit her daughter's family. She had light blue eyes that tended toward warmth, and a quality of attention that 40 years of managing 6-year-olds had honed into something very close to precision. She had seen this before. Not here specifically, but close enough to hear that the difference didn't matter. Her son-in-law's name was James Coleman. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon at Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center. He was black. 2 years ago, at this same gate, he had been pulled aside by a man in a blue Apex vest and asked, in front of a full boarding line, whether his first-class ticket had been issued correctly because there might have been a system error. He had shown his boarding pass. He had shown his ID. The agent had made him wait 8 minutes before allowing him to board last after every other passenger. James had not filed a complaint. He had not told anyone outside the family. He had been so hollowed out by the experience that he'd sat in silence for the entire flight. And when Peggy had tried to ask him about it later, he had said only, "I don't think anyone would believe me if I described it exactly." Peggy had believed him. She had believed him completely, and it had sat in her chest like a stone for 2 years. She opened her phone, found the camera, pressed record. The small red light began to blink. On the jet bridge in the doorway that separated the gate area from the boarding corridor, a young woman in an Apex uniform stood very still. Her name tag read Elena Vasquez, and she was 31 years old, and she had been a flight attendant for Apex for 6 years. She had been standing in the doorway, running through the pre-boarding checklist on her tablet, when Frank DeLuca had stopped Dominique Harlow. She had looked up. She had watched. Now, she set the tablet down slowly against the wall and looked at the screen of the boarding system mounted near the door. She scrolled to seat 3A. The entry was clear. Harlow, D. Seat 3A, first class. Confirmed, paid. Elena looked at Dominique sitting on the metal bench. She looked at Frank. She looked back at the screen. She took a breath. Walked toward Frank. Frank. Her voice was low. "I just checked the system. Her seat is confirmed. 3A, first class, paid booking." Frank looked at her with the kind of look a person uses when they want to communicate that someone has just overstepped a line that should have been obvious. "Get back inside, Elena. This is not your call to make, but she's Elena." His voice was quiet, but had an edge in it now that she recognized. Inside. Now. Elena stopped. She did not go back inside. She stayed at the threshold of the jet bridge door, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and did not take her eyes off the woman sitting on the bench. Dominique had not moved, had not changed her expression. The gold watch on her wrist caught the terminal light once as she shifted her hand slightly in her lap. Then she was still again. She was thinking about her mother. She was thinking about her mother sitting at the kitchen table at 3 a.m. with her coat still on. She was thinking about the sound of quiet crying that she had been small enough to pretend she couldn't hear. She was thinking about what her mother had chosen to do the next morning, and the morning after that, and all the mornings that followed. Don't let them make you bitter, baby. That's how they win. She breathed in. She breathed out. She waited. The two airport security officers arrived at 6:53 a.m. The timestamp would matter later. The taller one, whose name tag read Brennan, had a body camera clipped to his chest that activated automatically on approach. The small red indicator light began recording at 6:53 and 22 seconds. Brennan was mid-30s professional and bearing the kind of officer who actually looked at the situation before deciding what the situation was. He looked at Dominique Harlow sitting on the bench. He looked at Frank DeLuca. He looked at the 200 people in the boarding area who were now looking at him. He approached Dominique first. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened from your perspective?" "Certainly, officer. I boarded with a valid ticket that scanned green at the machine." Mr. DeLuca then asked me to step aside before I could reach my seat. I complied with his request immediately and without argument. "I've been waiting here since then. May I see your boarding pass and your identification?" She produced both without hesitation. Brennan examined them with the systematic attention of someone who had looked at a great many documents. The name matched. The photograph matched. The seat assignment was clearly printed. The flight number corresponded. The date was today's date. He turned to face Frank DeLuca. "Sir, I don't see any discrepancy in this passenger's documentation. Everything appears to be completely in order." His voice carried a note underneath the professionalism, not hostility, just the careful flatness of someone who wants the other person to hear exactly what is being said. "What exactly is the discrepancy you mentioned in your radio call?" Frank's confidence shifted. Not disappeared. It didn't disappear, but it moved the way furniture moves in an earthquake. Just slightly, just enough to notice. She didn't. He stopped, started again. She didn't match the seat assignment. Match in what way exactly? Please be specific. First-class passengers on this route typically... He stopped again. He had just heard himself. He had heard what the sentence sounded like if he finished it. He looked at the body camera on Brennan's chest with its steady red light. He looked at the line of passengers, many of whom were holding phones. There was an inconsistency in her overall presentation, he finished. The words came out soft and unconvincing like a verdict without evidence. In the boarding line, Peggy Okafor had been recording for 2 minutes and 47 seconds. Elena Vasquez had not moved from the threshold. Frank turned back toward the gate podium. He picked up the microphone. His voice, when it came through the speakers, was the practiced, neutral tone of someone who has made hundreds of announcements and knows how to sound official. "Attention Apex Airways passengers at gate C-22. We are experiencing a brief delay due to a documentation verification issue. We appreciate your patience and will resume boarding shortly. Thank you." The announcement traveled through the entire gate area. It reached every person who hadn't yet turned to look. It reached the families at the seats along the windows, the business travelers on their laptops, the couple with the toddler near the water fountain. It directed 200 people to notice a black woman sitting alone on a metal bench in a jet bridge while everyone else waited to board. Dominique heard the announcement. She did not look up. She was looking at the wall of the jet bridge across from the bench. At the Apex Airways logo printed there in corporate blue and silver. The same logo that appeared in the corner of the loan application file sitting in her bag right now. The same company requesting $4.8 billion from her fund. The same airline whose culture she was here to evaluate. This was the evaluation. She hadn't needed to schedule it. They had provided it themselves. On the other side of the wall inside the jet bridge doorway, Elena Vasquez closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them and stepped forward again. "Frank." Her voice was tighter now. "She has a confirmed booking. I checked the system personally. I'm telling you, her seat is Elena. He turned to face her fully now. There was something sharper in his eyes, a warning that came with history behind it. I told you to go back inside. If you want to have a conversation about your role here, we can have that conversation later. Right now, you need to go back inside and let me handle this. Elena looked at Dominique on the bench. Dominique was looking at the logo on the wall. She had not looked at Frank for the past several minutes the way someone stops watching a fire once they've understood it completely. Elena stepped back to the threshold. She did not go inside. She stayed there at the edge, 1 foot in each world, watching. Officer Brennan delivered the news with careful neutrality. He could not compel a private carrier to allow a passenger on board. The airline had operational authority over its own boarding process. That was the law. If Apex Airways was declining to board her, the airport security office did not have legal grounds to override that decision. Ma'am, the airline is declining to board you on this flight. You will need to speak with customer service at the main terminal about rebooking on a later departure. Dominique nodded once. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She began to gather her bag. Frank DeLuca walked over. He stood in front of the bench. He bent forward at the waist, not enough to be menacing, but enough to be intimate in the wrong way, the way someone leans in when they want to say something that sounds like a private courtesy but is actually a final assertion of territory. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of low that only works as a weapon if the other person understands what's underneath it. Ma'am, people in first class on this route tend to have a certain profile. He paused, just long enough. I'm sure you understand. 3 feet away, Peggy Okafor heard every word. Her thumb pressed harder on the record button. Her hands were trembling now, not from age but from a specific and precise fury that had been building in her chest for 2 years, since the night James Coleman came home from this airport and sat at the kitchen table and couldn't explain what he was feeling, because explaining it required the other person to believe something that most people found easier to doubt than to accept. She heard it. She had it. Dominique Harlow stood up from the bench. She did it slowly, the way someone stands when they have all the time in the world and are choosing deliberately not to rush. She reached down and picked up her bag. She straightened, and then she looked at Frank DeLuca, not with anger. Anger would have given him something to use, something to point to later, something to make the story about. She looked at him with the specific quality of attention her mother had used with the doctor who had humiliated her in front of a ward full of patients. The look that says, I see exactly what this is and I am recording every detail of it in a place you cannot reach. Frank DeLuca extended one hand toward the exit, not grabbing her, not touching her, but the gesture unmistakable. A direction, a dismissal, a hand that said, you go now, to a person who had just been sitting in a seat she had paid for. Peggy Okafor's camera caught it clearly. Elena Vasquez watched from the doorway. Something in her throat tightened. Dominique looked at the extended hand. Then she looked back at Frank's face. I'm going to need your full legal name for my personal records. He blinked. My records. What records? I document everything thoroughly, she said. It's a professional habit. She held eye contact for exactly 3 seconds of silence, long enough for the silence to mean something. Then she looked at Officer Brennan. I will need a copy of your body camera footage. Your department's policy allows citizen requests within 72 hours. Yes, ma'am, Brennan said. You can file a formal request with airport administration at the main terminal. She nodded. Then she looked one final time at the Apex Airways logo on the wall of the jet bridge. The blue, the silver, the corporate certainty of it. She turned and walked away from the jet bridge back through the gate area across the terminal floor. Her footsteps were even and unhurried. Her back was straight. She did not stop. She did not look back. 200 people watched her go. The gate area was completely silent. Elena Vasquez stood in the jet bridge doorway until Dominique disappeared around the corner of the terminal. Then she pressed her hand flat against the wall beside her and breathed. In the boarding line, Peggy Okafor lowered her phone. 4 minutes and 11 seconds of footage. Frank DeLuca's name tag was clearly visible in multiple frames. The Apex logo was visible throughout. Dominique's face was visible. The gesture was visible. Peggy looked at the footage for a moment. Then she looked at the empty space where Dominique Harlow had been. James, she whispered to no one in the terminal. To her son-in-law, 300 miles away at his desk at the hospital. You were never wrong. Flight 1142 had pushed back from the jet bridge at 7:19 and was now taxiing toward the runway. The boarding area held only a few stragglers. A woman fishing something from her carry-on, a custodial worker with a cart, a child who had lost a shoe temporarily and was now reunited with it. And Daniel Marsh. Daniel was 39 years old, a financial analyst at a Charlotte-based investment firm that focused on the transportation sector. He had been in the first-class boarding line this morning, directly behind the woman in the navy blazer who had been removed from the jet bridge. He had watched the entire thing. He was still there because he couldn't quite make himself leave. Something about her had stayed with him. Not her composure exactly, though her composure had been remarkable. Something in her eyes when she'd said those final words to the gate agent. "I'll be in touch, Mr. DeLuca." It wasn't a threat, it wasn't even a promise. It was the quiet statement of a person who was already 3 steps ahead and had no need to explain where they were going. Daniel worked with CEOs. He had sat across conference tables from 100 of them. He knew what the particular gravity of that position looked like when it was real and when it was performed. He had just watched something real. He bent down near the metal bench where she had been sitting. Something small was half hidden under the frame pressed against the floor, probably kicked there during the commotion, then stepped on by passing feet. He picked it up, a business card, bent at one corner, slightly scuffed, still completely legible. Dominique Harlow, Chief Executive Officer, Pinnacle Federal Capital. Daniel stared at it. Pinnacle Federal Capital, he knew that name. Everyone in transportation finance knew that name. He opened his phone and typed it anyway, confirming what his memory was already telling him. The first result was from the Financial Times dated 4 months ago. The woman who controls $40 billion in federal infrastructure funds. He scrolled down. Bloomberg, 6 weeks ago. Pinnacle Federal Capital CEO holds final approval authority on all major federal transportation loans. Wall Street Journal. 22 days ago, Apex Airways seeks $4.8 billion in federal funding amid mounting debt crisis. Decision expected within 2 weeks. Daniel Marsh read that last headline 3 times. He looked at the business card. He looked at the empty jet bridge door. He looked at the runway visible through the terminal window where a plane bearing the Apex Airways blue and silver livery was lifting off into the morning sky. His hands were cold. The terminal was warm, but his hands had gone cold. They had just removed the person who decides whether they survive from their own plane, while she was evaluating them. They had done this in front of 200 witnesses, and at least a dozen phone cameras and 1 airport security body camera, and they had done it without knowing any of it, without hesitation, in less than 15 minutes. He opened X. His thumbs moved quickly. He typed with the focused precision of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. The woman Apex Airways just removed from Flight 1142 at Charlotte Douglas. Her name is Dominique Harlow. She is the CEO who decides if Apex receives $4.8 billion in federal funding. Her signature is their survival, and they just escorted her off their plane. He attached a screen recording of the search results, posted it at 7:18 a.m., 50 views. He put his phone in his pocket and stood very still for a moment in the emptied gate area. Then he walked toward the exit because there was nothing left for him here. The rest of it was already in motion. If you're feeling what I'm feeling right now, pause for a second and ask yourself, what would you have done on that bench? Would you have stayed as calm as she did? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because this story is just getting started. The Uber driver's name was Marcus. He had the radio on low, a morning news station murmuring about traffic on I-85 and a forecasted afternoon thunderstorm. He didn't try to make conversation, which Dominique was grateful for. She sat in the back seat with her bag on the seat beside her and her phone face down in her lap. The phone had begun buzzing before the car left the departures lane. She counted 7 notifications before she turned the screen over so she couldn't see the light. She opened her laptop instead. The Apex file was still on the screen where she had left it this morning at the kitchen counter with her French press and the particular quiet of 5 a.m., the executive summary, the fleet data, the debt covenant breach, the 11,000 employees. She read it again, same words, same numbers, same families behind the numbers, but she was reading it now from the other side of something. From the other side of a metal bench in a jet bridge and a man's hand gesturing toward an exit, and a voice saying, "People in first class on this route tend to have a certain profile in the low, certain tone of someone who had said it before. Not for the first time. Not experimentally. The way you say things you have said enough times that they feel like policy." The numbers in the file hadn't changed. The Boeing delivery schedules hadn't changed. The debt ratios hadn't changed. What had changed was that she had now seen, with the specific precision of a professional, who spent her career reading between the lines of what companies submitted something that no financial filing had ever managed to capture accurately. Culture. The actual culture. Not the mission statement. Not the values page of the annual report. The thing that happened when the cameras weren't there, except that today they were. She looked at the 3 options she had been carrying in her head for the past week. She had always known it would come down to 3 choices. She had been letting them develop slowly, waiting for the right information to make the framework complete. Option A. Deny the loan. Apex doesn't get the money. The debt covenant triggers. Moody's downgrades the credit rating within 60 days. Bankruptcy proceedings begin. 11,000 jobs. Pension obligations for retirees who pushed wheelchairs through terminals for 30 years. All of it gone. And Dominique gets labeled as the person who let a federal agency's decision be influenced by a personal incident. Option B. Approve the loan as submitted. Apex gets $4.8 billion. Frank DeLuca goes back to Gate C-22 on Monday. The pattern continues. Nobody changes because nobody had to. Option C. She had been circling it for 3 days. She could feel its shape but hadn't yet given it a name. She looked out the window. The highway unspooled behind them. Charlotte's morning skyline flattened as they moved toward her neighborhood, toward the condo, toward the French press and the quiet. Her phone buzzed again. She turned it face down again. The watch ticked against her wrist. She thought about what her mother used to say when Dominique asked her why she kept going back. Why she kept working for a system that had on more than one occasion treated her as if she were less than what she was. Her mother had thought about that for a long moment, the kind of silence that meant the answer was already formed and was being chosen carefully. Because leaving doesn't fix it for the people who come after you, Lorraine had said. Leaving just leaves the problem where it is. You want to actually help someone. You stay, you do the work. And when you get enough power to change something, you change it. Not for you. For the next one. The Uber pulled up to the condo. Dominique closed the laptop and got out. She had a flight to rebook, and she had thinking to do. She was 9 years old. It was December. Baltimore. The kind of December that got into the walls of the apartment and stayed there until March, no matter how high you turned the baseboard heat. Dominique had been awake past midnight because she had been too cold to sleep, and she had heard the front door open. Her mother had come home from the night shift. Dominique lay still in the dark of her room and listened to the sounds. The click of the deadbolt. The careful quiet of someone trying not to wake anyone. The soft thud of a bag set on the kitchen floor. A long pause. Then not crying exactly. A kind of compressed sound, short, and controlled the sound of someone releasing something in the smallest possible increment. Dominique got up. She stood in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen in her socks and her Christmas pajamas, small enough that her mother hadn't noticed her yet. Lorraine Harlow was sitting at the kitchen table with her coat still on. Her nursing shoes were still on her feet, white leather stained at the toes, the left one split slightly at the sole, from months of double shifts. She had her hands flat on the table, and she was looking at them. Her mother was the most composed person Dominique had ever known. She had seen her mother face down angry patients, condescending doctors, administrators who spoke over her in meetings, patients' family members who addressed the white nurses first as a matter of reflex. She had never seen her mother crumble, not even close. But right now, at the kitchen table at 3 a.m, with her coat on and her hands flat on the formica, and her feet still in those worn-out shoes, Lorraine looked as if she were very carefully holding something together from the inside. Holding it by sheer decision. By the specific discipline of a woman who had decided a long time ago that she would not let certain things break her, and who held to that decision even on nights when it cost everything. There had been a doctor. Dominique would learn the details later in pieces over years. He was senior. He was white. He was the kind of man who had always been listened to in rooms where other people were not, and who had absorbed that experience as evidence that he deserved to be. He had written the wrong dosage on a patient's chart that night. A significant error. The kind of error that could have caused serious harm. Lorraine Harlow had caught it. She had recalculated the dosage, documented the correction, and gently, professionally, without embarrassment in the private language of a nurse to a physician who trusted her, flagged the discrepancy. He had not taken it as professional courtesy. He had taken it as a challenge. From a woman. From a black woman in nursing shoes who was supposed to execute orders, not question them. He had responded in the hallway outside the patient's room, in front of 3 nurses, 2 residents, and a patient's adult daughter, who was sitting in a chair against the wall waiting for news. He had called Lorraine's competence into question. Loudly. With the absolute certainty of someone who had never once needed to wonder whether the room would believe him over the person he was contradicting. The patient's daughter had watched. The residents had looked at the floor. The other nurses had found something urgent to attend to in other directions. Lorraine had said nothing in response. She had waited until he was finished. She had nodded once in the way of someone acknowledging that a thing has occurred, and she had gone back to her work. Her hands had been steady. Her face had revealed nothing. She had come home 3 hours later and sat down at the kitchen table with her coat on and her shoes still tied, and she had let the kitchen be the place where she held the pieces together for a few minutes, because it was the only place she could. Dominique stood in the doorway. Her mother looked up. She saw her daughter. She did not look away or straighten up too quickly or pretend the table sitting hadn't happened. She just looked at Dominique for a moment with an expression that was more tired than anything else. "Come here," she said. Dominique walked over. Her mother pulled out the chair beside her. Dominique sat down. They sat together at the kitchen table for a few minutes without saying anything. Then Lorraine put her hand over Dominique's, and she said the thing she said only once about that specific night, and never repeated again. "Baby, the world will try to make you feel small." It will try in all kinds of ways, some loud and some so quiet you almost miss them. You have two choices every single time that happens. You shrink, or you remember exactly who you are. She paused. I choose to remember. Every single day, even the hard days, especially the hard days. She stood up then. She took her coat off. She hung it on the hook by the door. She filled a glass of water at the sink and drank half of it. Okay, she said. Bedtime for both of us. She never spoke of it again. Dominique understood much later that this was not because she had moved on from it. It was because she had decided that it did not get to live in her house. In the Uber on the highway heading home, Dominique looked down at the watch, the scratched gold face, the second hand moving in its steady small circles. Her mother had gone back to that hospital the next morning, and the morning after that. She had gone back because leaving didn't fix it for the people who came after her. She had stayed and done the work and held herself together with both hands, and she had never let them turn her into what they were. Dominique opened her laptop. She created a new document. She typed 3 words at the top. Conditional Approval Framework. She rebooked on a United flight leaving at 10:15. Different terminal, different gate. She changed at the condo, drank a second cup of coffee standing at the counter, and was back in a car by 8:40. At the new gate, while she waited to board, she opened the Apex file and began to work. Not the financial projections, not the terms not yet, but the underlying data. Fleet verification, maintenance record cross-referencing, route viability modeling. The parts of her job that had nothing to do with what had happened at the gate and everything to do with whether this airline was actually a viable investment of federal money, regardless of anything else. The answer was complicated, which she had expected. The finances were genuinely troubled. This was not a company playing at distress for regulatory sympathy. The fleet age was real. The maintenance costs were real. The debt covenant breach was real. These were not manufactured problems designed to extract federal generosity. These were the consequences of years of inadequate reinvestment in an aging operation, compounded by 2 particularly brutal fiscal years. 11,000 people worked for a company that had real financial problems and a broken internal culture. Both of those things were true at the same time. That was Option C's territory, the space between Option A's nuclear consequence and Option B's complicit silence. The place where the money got approved, but the approval came with conditions that couldn't be written around or managed away or apologized past. Not punishment. Accountability with architecture. She closed the financial file and looked out the airplane window at the cloud layer below. She could see the Blue Ridge through a gap in the clouds, the ridgeline running gray-green and ancient in the morning light, the kind of landscape that existed before any of the human machinery she was navigating and would exist after. Her mother had loved the mountains. Her mother had loved them without sentimentality the way you love things that don't require anything from you and offer permanence in exchange. Dominique turned back to the screen. Option C was going to take shape today. It needed one more piece of information first, and she had a feeling the information was coming to her, not waiting for her to go find it. Daniel Marsh's post went live on X at 7:18 a.m. He had written it in less than 90 seconds standing in the emptied gate area at Charlotte Douglas with the business card in his free hand and the search results still open on his phone screen. The woman Apex Airways just removed from Flight 1142 at Charlotte Douglas. Her name is Dominique Harlow. She is the CEO who decides if Apex receives $4.8 billion in federal funding. Her signature is their survival, and they just escorted her off their plane. The screenshot showed 4 search results: the Financial Times headline, the Bloomberg piece, the Wall Street Journal story about the Apex loan application with its 22-day-old date stamp. Clear. undeniable. No editorializing beyond the facts themselves because the facts didn't need any. At 7:19, the post had 54 views. By 7:30, it had crossed 8,000. By 8 o'clock, it was at 90,000. And someone had screenshotted it and cross-posted it to Reddit, where it hit the front page of 3 different subreddits before 8:20. CNN had screen captured the tweet by 8:35. A financial news aggregator had sent it to their morning briefing email, which went out at 8:45 to 400,000 subscribers. By 9 a.m., the post had 560,000 views, and it was the #1 trending topic in the United States. The comments came in waves. She could have ended him with one sentence, and she said nothing. Let them bury themselves. Absolute discipline. I want to know who Frank DeLuca is. I want to know where he is right now. This airline has 14 days to survive, and they just did this. She bought her own first-class ticket to evaluate them, and this is what they showed her. Apex Airways is done. They just don't know it yet. Peggy Okafor posted the video to Facebook at 8:47 a.m. She wasn't on Twitter. She had tried it once, found it baffling, and returned to Facebook, where she had been since 2009 and where she knew how things worked. She wrote her caption carefully, the way she used to write instructions on the board for her second graders, clearly, specifically assuming that the reader needed all the relevant information in the right order. This happened this morning at Charlotte Douglas Airport Gate, C-22 Apex Airways boarding. The woman sitting on that bench held a valid first-class boarding pass that had already scanned green at the machine. The gate agent then followed her onto the jet bridge and asked her to step aside. Her name is Dominique Harlow. Look her up. I was there. I saw everything. I will not look away from what I saw. She attached the 4 minutes and 11 seconds of video. She hit post. Then she went to her kitchen and made tea because her hands were still trembling slightly, and she needed something to do with them. Her son called from Raleigh within 20 minutes. He had seen the post. His voice was tight with a complicated feeling that wasn't quite disbelief. Mom, do you know who she is? I'm learning, Peggy said. You need to see the tweet that's been going around. Mom, the woman you filmed. She controls whether Apex gets billions of dollars. She was there evaluating the airline, and they pulled her out of the line. Peggy sat down at her kitchen table. Your father-in-law called me, she said. James. He saw my post. Her son was quiet for a moment. What did he say? Peggy looked at the teapot on the stove. He didn't say anything at first. Then he said thank you for staying. Peggy, that was all. She had cried a little after she hung up with her son. Not from sadness exactly. From something that felt like pressure releasing. Like a door that had been shut for 2 years, finally admitting that it was a door. By mid-morning, Peggy's video had been shared onto Reddit, then picked up by 2 journalists, and cross-referenced with Daniel Marsh's post. A CNN producer called her at 10:15. She sat at her kitchen table in Raleigh with her tea going cold beside her, and answered every question, carefully and completely. What made you start recording? I've seen what this kind of thing looks like, Peggy said. My son-in-law, Dr. James Coleman, was treated almost exactly the same way at that same gate 2 years ago. He filed a complaint and nothing came of it. He was humiliated in front of a plane full of people, and then he had to sit through a 3-hour flight feeling ashamed of something that wasn't his fault. When I saw it happening again, I wasn't going to be the person who looked away. The producer asked her what she noticed about Dominique Harlow's behavior during the incident. Peggy thought for a moment. She was the calmest person in that jet bridge, Peggy said. Calmer than the officer. Calmer than anyone watching. She sat on that bench with her hands in her lap and her back completely straight, and she looked like a woman who was making a very careful list of everything she was seeing. That's not what fear looks like. That's not what defeat looks like. I didn't know who she was yet, but I knew that. She paused. I think she knew something the rest of us didn't. By noon, Apex Airways stock had dropped 2.5% on light trading volume as retail investors reacted to the social media coverage before institutional analysts had fully processed the situation. By 1 p.m., it had dropped another percentage point. Financial news anchors were using phrases like significant reputational exposure and material risk to the pending federal application. At Apex Airways headquarters in Atlanta, the morning had just violently become something else entirely. Nobody had seen it coming. That was the thing about evaluating people when they thought nobody important was watching. They showed you exactly what they were. That evening, Dominique sat at her desk in the dark D.C. apartment with the city lights through the window replacing any need for lamps. On the television screen across the room, which she had turned on for the background noise of normalcy, and had immediately regretted her own face appeared on CNN, then MSNBC, then CNN again. She muted it before she could hear what was being said. She opened her laptop, the Apex file, the 3 options. Option C with its single heading and nothing beneath it yet. She looked at the watch. 38 years her mother had worn it. Through the doctor who had humiliated her in the hallway, through the patients who had called her by her first name without asking, and called the white nurses Miss, through the budget cuts and the mandatory overtime and the nights when she came home and sat at the kitchen table in her coat, because she needed somewhere to put the weight of it before she could carry it up to bed. She had worn it through all of that, and she had never been other than what she was. She had never let them make her small. She had never let them turn her into what they were. That's how you win, not by shrinking to the shape they've decided you should fit. By staying so completely yourself that there's no room in the picture for the version of you they've invented. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it from habit. Unknown number. She almost put it back down. Then she read the first line of the text. Ms. Harlow. My name is Sandra Oviedo. I'm an internal accountant at Apex Airways. She picked up the phone. I was in the building the day they found out who you were. I was in the meeting. I heard what the executive said. I recorded it. Dominique read the message. Her face in the glow of the phone screen was unreadable. You need to hear this recording, not for the press, for you and for what comes next. I know what I'm risking by telling you this. I'm telling you anyway, because there are people who should have said something a long time before now, and I am tired of not being one of them. She set the phone down on the desk. She looked at the Apex logo visible in the corner of a document open on her laptop screen. Blue and silver, the same colors as the jet bridge wall at gate C-22. She picked the phone back up. When can we meet, she typed. The response came in 40 seconds. Tomorrow. Anywhere you choose. Somewhere quiet. I need it to be somewhere quiet. Dominique looked at the watch again. The second hand moved. The city hummed outside the window. On the muted television, a banner crawled across the bottom of the screen. CEO, Dominique Harlow, holds decision authority on Apex Airways' $4.8 billion federal application. She typed, I know a place. I'll send you the address in the morning. Then she closed the Apex file on her laptop. Not because she was done with it, because she had enough of its shape now that she could let it rest for the night. Tomorrow, she would have the final piece. Tonight, the watch ticked on her wrist, and the city moved below, and she sat with the quiet certainty of a woman who had decided without drama what kind of person she intended to be. The same kind as her mother. Exactly that kind. No adjustment necessary. 10:45 in the morning. Apex Airways corporate headquarters. Atlanta, Georgia. Richard Calloway. Chief Operating Officer had been in the quarterly budget review meeting since 9 a.m. He was 56 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of physical presence that took up a room in a way he had stopped noticing because he had always taken up rooms. 24 years with Apex, starting when the airline was still a regional carrier with regional ambitions. He had helped build the route network. He had managed 2 mergers. He had shepherded the company through 2 financial crises and 1 pandemic, and had emerged from each of them with his title intact and his confidence undiminished. His phone was on silent in his jacket pocket. At 10:47 the phone vibrated. He ignored it. It vibrated again. He noted it and kept his eyes on the budget figures on the presentation screen. 3rd vibration. He glanced at the screen without picking it up. Across the table, a laptop screen caught his peripheral vision. On it, he could see a news aggregator page, and in the top story, 2 words, Apex Airways. He picked up his phone. He read the headline. He stood up from the table. "Excuse me," he was in the hallway before the meeting had fully registered his departure. He called his VP of Communications from the elevator. She picked up in one ring, which told him she already knew. How bad, he said. The tweet has 600,000 views and is still climbing. There's a video from a passenger. 4 minutes. Clear audio. His name tag is visible throughout. Whose name tag? Frank DeLuca. Gate C-22. Charlotte, the morning boarding. And the woman is Dominique Harlow, CEO of Pinnacle Federal Capital. She has final approval authority on our loan application. Richard, the application has 14 days left on the review clock. He pressed the elevator button for the 14th floor 4 times in quick succession as if additional pressure would accelerate the process. "Get me legal," he said. "Get me PR. Get me government affairs. Get me Douglas Pierce if he's in the building. And get me Frank DeLuca on the phone in the next 10 minutes. Frank is off shift. He clocked out at 7:45. I don't care if he's sleeping. Get him on the phone." The elevator opened. He walked to the large conference room, the one with the runway view. The assembled team arrived in pieces over the following 8 minutes. Douglas Pierce, CEO, came last, and he came with the expression of a man who has had the floor give way under him before and recognizes the sensation. They all looked at screens, at the tweet, at Peggy Okafor's video, which was already being looped on CNN, at the Apex stock ticker, which had moved 1.5% in the wrong direction in the past 90 minutes. Richard Calloway stood at the head of the table. "Tell me everything about what happened at that gate this morning," he said. Exactly what happened in order, leaving nothing out. The Government Affairs Director pulled up the operational incident report filed by Frank DeLuca at 7:30. She read it aloud. 43 words describing a documentation discrepancy resolved by requesting passenger rebooking. 43 words for the thing that was currently trending nationally and had wiped $40 million off the company's market cap in less than 3 hours. "Where is she now?" Calloway said. "Washington. She rebooked on a United flight, arrived D.C. at 11:20. Has she said anything publicly?" "Nothing. No statement, no social media, nothing." Calloway was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the runway at an Apex tail lifting off in the distance, climbing toward the blue. "She's not going to call us," he said. "She's going to wait. She's going to let this develop, and she's going to collect every piece of it." He turned back to the table. "We need to get in front of this. Direct apology, personal outreach. We make it clear this does not reflect Apex values. Frank DeLuca was acting against every protocol. We are mortified. We are taking immediate corrective action." And the loan review, the legal counsel said carefully, "That's a separate track. The loan is a federal process. We cannot appear to be conflating the two." He paused. "But we absolutely need her to understand that this company is not who Frank DeLuca is, before she finalizes anything." Douglas Pierce, who had been quiet until now, looked up from the table. "Richard," he said. "Who trained Frank DeLuca?" Calloway looked at him. Who supervised him for 19 years, Pierce continued. Who reviewed the incident reports, who signed off on his evaluations. He looked around the table. Because if there are 30 complaints against one gate agent at one gate over less than 2 years, and we are only finding out about them because a federal officer's business card fell off a bench this morning, then this is not about Frank DeLuca. This is about us. No one spoke. Pierce stood up. Get the Charlotte operations records, all of them. Everything filed at Gate C22 for the past 3 years. I want to know what we knew and when we knew it. He moved toward the door. And Richard, call her. Personally. Today, not through an intermediary, you. He left. Calloway stood at the head of the table and watched another Apex aircraft on approach through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Blue tail-silver letters gear coming down. And he thought about 11,000 people who had no idea what was happening in this room right now and whose futures were entirely bound up in what happened next. Carlos Rivera had his email open at 9 a.m. He was 41 years old, 3 kids, a mortgage in Decatur, and 15 years of investigative reporting at the Atlanta Journal behind him. He was not a man who saw injustice and wondered if it was worth writing about. He was a man who saw injustice and immediately started making a list of documents he was going to need. He had seen the Apex tweet at 7:45 while eating breakfast. He had watched Peggy Okafor's video twice before his coffee was finished. By 8:15, he was at his desk. By 8:30, he had filed an expedited public records request to Charlotte Douglas Airport for all formal incident reports involving gate staff at the Apex terminal for the past 24 months. By 9 o'clock, he had sent carefully worded messages to 4 sources inside the airline industry. At 12:30, an email arrived from an address he didn't recognize. No subject line. One attachment, a file named DeLuca Internal Tracker Export. He opened it carefully and read what he had. Apex Airways Internal Escalation Tracker Database. The records had been filtered by employee name before being exported. The name at the top of the filter, DeLuca Frank G. Employee IDOO, 773, Senior Gate Supervisor, Charlotte Douglas Hub, Gate C22, 31 formal complaints. 22 months of documented incidents. The pattern was not subtle. 26 of the 31 complainants were passengers of color. The complaints, described with striking consistency, asked to prove financial ability to afford a ticket, questioned about the authenticity of identification, made to wait without explanation, while other passengers boarded, subjected to public announcements drawing other passengers' attention to them. The resolution column for every single complaint contained one of 2 entries. Resolved internally. Passenger compensated with travel voucher. Case closed or investigated. No policy violation found. Case closed. Not one formal reprimand. Not one required retraining session. Not one documented disciplinary conversation with a supervisor. 19 years, 1 gate, 31 complaints, 0 consequences. Carlos read through it twice. Then he opened a new document and wrote the headline. 31 complaints, 0 consequences. The Apex Airways, gate agent who targeted passengers of color for 2 years. While his supervisors looked away, he called his editor. I have the database, he said. I need 3 days to build the full evidentiary record. Then we run it. Is it solid? The database came from inside. I can corroborate the individual complaint details against public records and passenger accounts. It's solid. Carlos looked at the spreadsheet on his screen. Column after column. 31 rows. 26 passengers who had tried to tell someone what had happened to them and had been handed a travel voucher and a closed case file. We're as ready as we're going to be, he said, and we're the only people who are going to tell their story correctly. So yes, we're running it. Richard Calloway tried to reach Dominique by phone twice on day 2. Both calls went to voicemail. On day 3, he left a message he had composed in his head over the course of 6 hours. Ms. Harlow, this is Richard Calloway, Chief Operating Officer of Apex Airways. I want to express my deepest and most sincere personal apology for the incident at our Charlotte gate. What happened was completely unacceptable and does not in any way reflect who we are as a company. Mr. DeLuca has been placed on administrative leave pending a full internal review. I am absolutely certain we can find a way to address your concerns in a manner that is meaningful to you. The loan situation is very important to this company and to the 11,000 people who depend on it. I hope we can talk. Dominique listened to the voicemail that evening. She saved it to her documentation folder. She did not call back. On day 4, a courier package arrived at Pinnacle Federal Capital's D.C. offices, addressed to Dominique Harlow personally. Inside the sealed envelope, 2 first-class Apex Airways tickets valid indefinitely. A handwritten letter on heavy cream stationery bearing Apex's embossed letterhead, signed by Douglas Pierce, and a cashier's check in the amount of $750,000. The memo line read, "For your inconvenience and any distress occasioned thereby." Nia brought the opened package to Dominique's office door. "Should I prepare a response?" "Return it," Dominique said. "Everything in the envelope. Unopened check included. Brief cover note." Ms. Harlow declines to accept these items and has no further comment at this time. Nothing more than that. No signature, no signature. On day 6, Calloway appeared on CNBC at 7 p.m. He wore his best Navy suit. The phrasing was too precise to be improvised. We take every customer concern with absolute seriousness at Apex Airways. Mr. DeLuca's actions were not in keeping with our company values, and he has been placed on administrative leave. Apex has never tolerated discrimination of any kind throughout our company's history. The interviewer leaned forward. "What about Ms. Harlow specifically? Given her role in reviewing Apex's federal loan application, should she recuse herself from the decision?" Calloway's prepared smile was thin and deployed with precision. "Ms. Harlow is obviously a distinguished professional with an impressive career, and we have the highest respect for her personally. But she was directly and personally involved in an incident with our company, and there is a legitimate question, not one we raise with any hostility, about whether anyone in that position can remain entirely objective about a multi-billion-dollar federal decision affecting this company. We have raised this concern through the appropriate regulatory channels." Dominique was watching from her apartment with the sound on. She watched the segment to its end. She did not change her expression. She reached for a notepad and wrote 3 words. That was a mistake, not the claim itself. She had been expecting the recusal argument. The mistake was what it forced. Calloway had now publicly declared Dominique a compromised decision-maker, which meant that whatever she decided about the loan would be scrutinized through the lens of whether it was motivated by personal grievance, which meant she needed her decision to be so precisely documented, so thoroughly grounded in the financial records, so impeccably constructed, that no reasonable person could find a thread of personal interest to pull. Option C needed to be bulletproof. Not just fair, bulletproof. She opened the Apex financial file and worked until 1 a.m. She turned the television off. The room went to its city-lit darkness. She sat at her desk with the lamp off, turning option C over in her mind the way her mother had turned the problems over in her hands before acting on them. She was not going to build a punishment mechanism dressed up as accountability. That was not what this was. That was not who she was. Every condition had to be defensible on the merits. Every requirement had to address a real, documented failure in Apex's operations, customer service record, or corporate governance. Nothing personal. everything grounded. She thought about 11,000 people. She thought about the 7 people she would read about in Carlos Rivera's draft article. The cardiologist in his hospital badge, the professor returning from Geneva, the veteran with his service ribbons, the 15-year-old girl made to stand to the side while every other passenger boarded. None of them had the business card. None of them had the financial leverage. They had just had the thing happen to them, and then they had gone home. And some of them had filed complaints that went nowhere, and some of them had been too exhausted or too ashamed or too certain that nothing would come of it to file anything at all. They were the reason option C existed. She wrote until midnight. Then she stopped. She had almost everything she needed. Tomorrow she would have the last piece. The watch ticked on her wrist, and the city moved outside. The second hand moved inside steady as a breath, steady as the particular decision her mother had made every single morning for 38 years, to go back to the work and be better at it than anyone had a right to expect. That was the inheritance. Not money, not even the watch. The posture, the practice, the daily decision. She closed the laptop. She went to bed. In 2 days, she would walk into a federal hearing room, and Richard Calloway would be in the front row, and none of it would feel like triumph. It would feel like work. The right kind, the kind worth doing. Carlos Rivera received an email from an unknown address at 6:52 a.m. Mr. Rivera, you should know what Apex is planning. This email was sent by Richard Calloway to the legal department 3 days ago. I am forwarding it because I cannot keep being part of this and stay the person I want to be. Below that, the forwarded email. Carlos read it twice in the parking deck with his coffee going cold in his hand. Calloway's email to Apex Legal dated 4 days prior. We need leverage against Rivera's story immediately. Identify his sources inside the company. Review their communications contracts and non-disclosure agreement status. We will need to act quickly if we determine who is leaking. Separately, conduct a thorough research file on Dominique Harlow. Full background, career history, past decisions. Any controversy, any criticism, any vulnerability or weakness that can be credibly amplified. We need material we can use if this goes further. Priority, find something that calls her judgment or objectivity into question before she finalizes the loan decision. Get me results by end of week. Carlos finished his coffee. He sat for another minute in the quiet of the parking deck. Then he called Dominique Harlow's office line. She answered. Miss Harlow, Carlos Rivera, Atlanta Journal. I need to tell you something before I go any further with my reporting. Go ahead. Apex is coming at both of us. I received a forwarded copy of an internal email from Calloway to their legal team. They're pulling your background and looking for anything they can use to undermine your credibility or push for your recusal. And they're trying to identify my sources inside the company. They also sent a cease and desist to my editor this morning, demanding we retract the DeLuca complaint database story before publication. A short silence on the line. Are you retracting it? No. Good. Mr. Rivera let them dig. You're not concerned about what they might find. I'm concerned about what the right decision is for 11,000 people and for every passenger who's going to fly Apex after whatever I decide. That concern takes up most of the available space. Her voice was even unruffled. My career has been examined under a magnifying glass since my first year at Pinnacle. Let them look. They will find the work. That's all there is to find. He believed her. One more thing, Carlos said. The cease and desist is not going to stop publication, but I want you to know it's out there. Thank you for telling me, she said. Do good work, Mr. Rivera. She hung up. He went to his desk and worked. 7 people stood together on the steps of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, in the October morning light. Different cities, different professions, different ages. One gate, one man in a blue vest. One identical pattern repeated across 2 years. Carlos Rivera stood to the side with a recorder. A CNN camera crew had set up on the steps. 3 local television stations were represented. Peggy Okafor stood with them. Not as a victim, as a witness. Dr. Marcus Webb stepped to the temporary microphone first. He was 52 years old, black with the composed bearing of a man who had spent a career in operating theaters where composure was the floor, not the ceiling. He wore his hospital ID badge. He had worn it specifically today because the last time he had stood at Gate C-22, he had been wearing it, and it had made no difference whatsoever. I am a cardiologist at Duke University Medical Center. I perform open-heart surgery. On the morning of March 14th of last year, I was flying to a medical conference in Boston in a first-class seat I had purchased with my own money. At Gate C-22, Charlotte Douglas, a man in an Apex Gate supervisor's uniform, asked me in front of the entire boarding line whether I could actually afford my first-class ticket. He paused. I was wearing my hospital ID. My credentials were visible on the lanyard around my neck. It did not matter. He made me wait 7 minutes while he pretended to verify a ticket that had already scanned green. Then he let me board last. After every other passenger. Professor Isabel Reyes, 44, from UNC Chapel Hill. He examined my faculty ID and announced, loudly, in front of everyone in the line, that it didn't look official. I had just returned from presenting my research at an academic conference in Geneva, Switzerland. My institution's ID, which I have used internationally without incident for 11 years, apparently did not look official enough for Gate C-22. Sergeant First Class Leonard Bright, 61, retired. 28 years of service. His service ribbons were on his jacket lapel. He told me he would need to see my military orders as proof of my travel authorization. I have been flying commercially since 1987. I have never once been asked for military orders. I was flying home to see my grandchildren for the holidays. The only authority I needed was a boarding pass which he had already scanned. He looked directly at the camera. I stood there for 11 minutes. My grandchildren were waiting. Aisha Williams, 15 years old. She stood between her mother and her older brother. She held a printed copy of her old Apex boarding pass in her hands, folded in quarters. When she spoke, her voice was the clearest sound on those courthouse steps. He told me my ticket was probably a computer error. He made me stand to the side, by myself, while every single other passenger boarded the plane. I was flying alone to visit my dad in Philadelphia. I had my boarding pass, I had my school ID, I had everything I was supposed to have. He made me wait until the jetway door was almost closing before he let me get on. She looked down at the folded boarding pass in her hands. I thought I had done something wrong. I thought it was my fault somehow. I kept thinking about what I had done wrong. It was my birthday that day. David Morales, 37, aerospace engineer, had watched 41 other passengers walk by without a single question while he opened every pocket of his carry-on bag. 2 more accounts followed. Different dates, different flights. One pattern. When the last person had spoken, Peggy Okafor approached the microphone. My son-in-law, Dr. James Coleman, was treated the same way at this same gate 2 years ago. He filed a complaint. Nothing happened. He was a surgeon who had been humiliated in a boarding line, and he spent a 3-hour flight wondering if he had imagined it somehow, because when something like that happens in front of 200 people and everyone pretends they didn't see it, you start to question what you know is real. She paused. He didn't imagine it. These people didn't imagine it. And every time an institution decides that a complaint like this is not worth a formal response, They are telling every person in that group, every future passenger who looks like any of these people, that their experience doesn't count and their word isn't enough. She looked up. Today it counts. Today their word is enough. And I'm grateful I had my phone charged. A few people in the small crowd laughed briefly, and the laughter was the specific kind that releases something. Carlos Rivera received the email from Elena Vasquez on day 9 at 8:14 a.m. It came from a personal email address, not a company account. Mr. Rivera, I was the flight attendant on duty at Gate C-22 on the morning of the incident involving Ms. Harlow. I want to correct several things that have been inaccurately reported. I was present. I checked the boarding system. I attempted to intervene. I am prepared to make a statement on the record. They arranged to meet that afternoon at a coffee shop 25 minutes outside Charlotte. Elena arrived in jeans and a gray cardigan, her Apex uniform in a bag she had left in the car. I checked the system before Frank started his radio call, she said. Her seat was confirmed. Seat 3A, first class. Paid booking. Dominique Harlow, clear and clean in the record. There was no discrepancy. I told Frank that. He told me to go back inside. What did you do? I stayed at the door. I didn't go back inside. She looked at the table, which is maybe the one thing I did right that morning. Why didn't you say more at the time? Go over his head directly to the terminal manager. She was quiet for a moment. Because Frank has been there 19 years, she said. And I've been there 6, and I've watched what happens when junior crew members challenge senior supervisors on judgment calls. It becomes a performance review issue. It becomes a conversation about whether you're a team player. She looked up. I knew what I saw was wrong. I couldn't make myself walk away from the door. But I didn't go far enough. What changed? She set down the coffee cup. I have been flying since I was 24 years old. 6 years. In those 6 years, I have seen this happen. Not at that specific level, not always that openly, but I have seen passengers treated differently based on how they looked and what they were wearing, and what the gate agent decided about them before they even opened their mouths. And every time there's a version of me somewhere nearby who notices and who doesn't say enough. She was very still. I thought about the people who came before her, the people who didn't have a business card for someone to find, who just went home, who wondered the way you wonder after something like that whether anyone would have believed them if they'd said something. She looked at Carlos directly. Those people deserved someone to say what they saw. I'm saying it now. It's late. I know it's late. I'm saying it anyway. Carlos asked if she was prepared for the professional consequences. I talked to an employment attorney, Elena said. What I witnessed is a matter of public concern. There are protections. She paused. I'm not saying I'm not scared. I'm saying I'm less scared of the consequences than I am of being the person who stayed quiet. Carlos nodded. He turned off the recorder. One thing off the record. How was she, Ms. Harlow, during the whole incident? Elena thought about it. About the woman on the metal bench with her hands in her lap and her back straight and the gold watch catching the terminal light. She was the calmest person in that jet bridge, Elena said. Calmer than Frank. Calmer than the security officers. She sat there like she was completely prepared for exactly this and was simply waiting for the people around her to finish doing what they were going to do. She paused. I've thought about it a lot these past few days. She wasn't performing calm. She just was calm. There's a difference. Carlos agreed that there was a difference. He turned the recorder back on. Elena Vasquez gave her full account on the record, and it ran the next morning in the Atlanta Journal under Carlos Rivera's byline. Day 9. Evening. A coffee shop in a strip mall on the eastern edge of Charlotte. Dominique sat in the back booth with her back to the wall. Sandra Oviedo arrived 4 minutes early. Dark hair, dark coat, the specific quality of someone who had made a significant decision and was now living in the 30 seconds before the consequences of it became real. Sandra sat down across from her. She wrapped both hands around the paper cup. Her hands were steady. Dominique noticed that. But her jaw was tight in the way of someone keeping something controlled by effort. "I could lose everything by doing this," Sandra said. "Not as a complaint. As an accounting, I know," Dominique said. 7 years at Apex, pension vesting and 3 more. "My department head is a good person. Most of the people I work with are good people. This isn't about them. I understand." Sandra looked at her, measuring something. Then she seemed to arrive at whatever conclusion she had been circling. "My cousin's name is Valentina. She was on a United flight out of Houston 2 years ago. Gate agent pulled her out of the first-class line. Different airline, different city, same story. She filed a complaint. United sent her a form letter. She took the travel voucher they offered because she didn't know what else to do, and then she felt ashamed for taking it like she'd let herself be bought off." Sandra's voice was even. "She stopped flying for 18 months. She said she just didn't have the energy to deal with wondering every time." Dominique nodded. "When I saw what happened to you, when the story broke, I thought I actually have something that matters here. I'm not just a bystander who watched something happen. I was in the room." Sandra reached into her coat pocket and set her phone on the table. "I work in the accounting department. 2 days after your incident, they called an emergency senior leadership meeting. I was assigned to set up the room and stay available for refreshments during the session. Senior leadership doesn't always remember that the person bringing in coffee can hear what's being said." "What happened in the meeting?" Sandra unlocked her phone, navigated to an audio file, and placed it on the table between them. "I'm going to play you part of it," she said. "The part at the beginning when they were still processing who you were and what it meant." She pressed play. The audio quality was imperfect, recorded on a phone in a coat pocket with ambient room noise. But the voices were clear, recognizable, specific. A voice, Calloway's, "Tell me exactly who she is." An assistant's voice reading the summary, "Dominique Harlow. Pinnacle Federal Capital. Federal Loan Authority, $4.8 billion application currently in review." Then a long pause on the recording. Several seconds of silence that had a texture to it. The texture of a room full of people absorbing the specific weight of what they had just heard. Then Calloway again. Lower. Closer to the recorder. "If she denies us that funding this company is finished." Finished? Do you understand what I'm saying? We're talking bankruptcy within 18 months, 12,000 jobs, another voice. "What do we do?" And then Calloway even lower the words, arriving with a quietness that was more frightening than shouting would have been. "Whatever it takes. You charm her first. You try the personal outreach, the sincere apology, make her feel heard. If that doesn't work, you find something, anything, she'll appreciate in material terms, and you make it available to her. And if none of that works, then you go after her credibility. You build a case for recusal. You get her pulled from the decision entirely. I don't care how it gets done. I need this problem to go away. Make it go away." The audio ended. Sandra picked the phone up and locked the screen. The back booth was very quiet. The television murmured in the corner. Someone at the front laughed at something. Dominique sat with her hands flat on the table. Her expression had not changed. The gold watch on her wrist caught the fluorescent light once and then was still. She had been carrying Option C for 4 days. She had been building its framework from financial data and documented complaint records and the accounts of 7 people who had stood on courthouse steps in the October morning and said what had happened to them. She had not needed this recording to know what option C needed to contain, but she needed it to confirm with the specific precision of a professional who dealt in documented evidence that what she was looking at was not an isolated incident of one gate agent's behavior. It was a company whose leadership, when faced with the consequences of that behavior, had chosen, immediately explicitly without apparent internal dissent, to make the problem disappear rather than address what had caused it. That changed the scope, not the decision. The scope. She looked at Sandra. "Is there more?" "There's more," Sandra said. "I have 43 minutes of that meeting. I need a copy of everything." "I know." Sandra reached into her bag and produced a small drive. "I made this for you." Dominique took it. She held it for a moment. Then she looked at Sandra directly. "You took a significant risk," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise. I know what I'm risking. I won't let it be for nothing." Sandra nodded. She picked up her paper cup and drank the last of her coffee and set the empty cup precisely in the center of the table. "There are people in that company who are good," she said quietly, "who do their work well and treat people decently and come home to their families and have no idea that the leadership team was sitting in a conference room figuring out how to discredit a woman they'd just watched be humiliated at an airport gate." She looked at the table. "They deserve better leadership than that." "Yes," Dominique said, "they do." She came home at 11:30 p.m. She put the drive Sandra had given her in a secure document safe and sent the digital copy to the encrypted archive her legal team maintained for sensitive materials. She changed into comfortable clothes and sat at her desk and did not turn the television on. She opened the Apex file. All of it, the financial projections, the debt structure, the fleet, data, the maintenance cost analysis, the Carlos Rivera database she had received on background, and the clean document titled Conditional Approval Framework. She added to it now. She added methodically the way her mother had been methodical about everything that mattered. The way Lorraine had double-checked medication dosages, had reread her nurse's notes before signing them, had never let the rush of an overcrowded ward become an excuse for imprecision. Precision was respect. Precision was what you owed to the people whose lives depended on you getting it right. The framework took shape. 1. Immediate termination of Frank DeLuca for documented pattern of discriminatory behavior across 31 complaints over 22 months. No severance package, no letter of recommendation. His name submitted to the Federal Aviation Consumer Protection Database for discriminatory conduct. 2. Termination or formal reassignment of Richard Calloway, COO, based on documented evidence of attempted interference with a federal funding decision and direction, to staff to pursue discrediting the reviewing officer through any means available. Evidence audio recording secured and archived. 3. Independent Oversight Board for Customer Service Complaints. Not internal review, not self-reported resolution, but an independent panel with rotating membership including passenger advocates and community representatives. Quarterly public reporting. Transparent resolution process accessible to any complainant. 4. Mandatory dignity and anti-bias training for all customer-facing employees across all Apex hubs. Third-party administered. No grandfather clauses based on seniority, no exemptions. Compliance verified by the independent board. 5A compensation fund of $15 million for documented victims of discriminatory gate practices. No non-disclosure agreements required for recipients. No conditions. 6. Compliance audits at months 12 and 24. Conducted by independent auditors approved by Pinnacle Federal Capital. Failure to meet benchmarks on any condition triggers a loan recall mechanism with penalty interest. She read it back. Each point was defensible on its own merits. Each addressed a documented failure in Apex's operations, culture, or governance. None of it required the incident at Gate C-22 as its only justification, The complaint database, the recording, the testimony of Elena Vasquez, the statements of 7 passengers, all of it built the same case independently. She was not punishing Apex for what had happened to her. She was holding them accountable for what the evidence showed they were and what the evidence showed they had chosen to do about it. She signed the document electronically, uploaded it to the secure Pinnacle system, sent the formal notification to the Federal Infrastructure Board that her recommendation would be submitted at the scheduled hearing 2 days from now. Then she looked at the watch. 4:47 a.m. She thought about her mother going in for the morning shift. She thought about the kitchen table and the coat still on and the hands pressed flat on the formica, and the 10 minutes of silence before the cup of tea, and then the day beginning again, cleanly, without the weight of the night before being carried into it. She closed the laptop. She went to sleep. In 2 days she would walk into a federal hearing room, and Richard Calloway would be in the front row, and she would read each of those 6 points into the record while he listened, and the room would be full of cameras, and none of it would feel like triumph. It would feel like work. The right kind, the kind worth doing. Day 11. Federal Infrastructure Investment Board Headquarters, Washington, D.C., 9 a.m. The hearing room had the particular gravity of spaces designed for consequence. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, the seal of the Department of Transportation, rendered in gold and blue on the wall behind the raised dais. Long tables arranged in a U-shape, each one bearing water pitchers and identification placards, and the accumulated weight of decisions that had affected millions of people who would never set foot in this room. 4 television camera crews had set up in the designated press area. Financial correspondents from Bloomberg, CNBC, and Reuters occupied the journalist section. A group of 6 people sat together near the back: Marcus Webb, Isabel Reyes, Leonard Bright, and 3 others from the courthouse steps, because they had been invited by the subcommittee chair's office and they had come. In the front row center section, Douglas Pierce, CEO of Apex Airways, in a charcoal suit. 3 corporate attorneys flanked him, legal pads, open pens in hand. Richard Calloway sat beside Pierce. He had not looked toward the door since he arrived. His jaw was set. His eyes were focused on the middle distance just above the dais, the particular gaze of someone who is managing something internally and doing it without help. Senator Diane Marchetti, 71, silver-haired chair of the Transportation Infrastructure Subcommittee, looked out at the assembled room with the calm authority of someone who had presided over hundreds of these hearings and understood precisely how much they mattered and precisely how much theater they sometimes contained. She tended to minimize the theater. She found it inefficient. The door at the back of the room opened. Dominique Harlow walked in. Navy blazer, white blouse, worn leather bag, the gold watch. Her footsteps on the marble floor were even and unhurried, the same footsteps that had walked away from Gate C-22 8 days ago. She took her seat. She set the leather bag beside her chair. She opened it and removed a single folder. Senator Marchetti gavelled the session to order. Ms. Harlow, you have the floor. Dominique stood. She moved to the microphone. The room was fully quiet. She looked at the folder. She looked at the room. She did not look at Richard Calloway. Thank you, Senator. I'll be brief. Her voice was clear, without being loud the way voices are when they carry their own authority and don't need the room to amplify it for them. On the morning of October 14th, I boarded an Apex Airways flight at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. I held a valid first-class ticket for Seat 3A. That ticket had already scanned green at the boarding machine. I had committed no violation of any policy or regulation. I was removed from the jet bridge by a gate supervisor named Frank DeLuca before reaching my seat. She paused. Let the sentence sit. That incident reflected a documented pattern. Mr. DeLuca accumulated 31 formal complaints over 22 months at Gate C-22. 26 of those complaints came from passengers of color who described being questioned about their ability to afford their tickets, questioned about the authenticity of their identification, subjected to public announcements drawing other passengers' attention to them, or made to wait without explanation while other passengers boarded without issue. Not one of those 31 complaints resulted in formal disciplinary action. Not one required retraining. Not one produced a documented supervisory conversation. Every single one was closed internally, resolved with a travel voucher, and removed from active consideration. She turned the page. The incident also reflected a corporate response. Now she looked up and toward the front row. Not with heat, with the specific attention of someone making sure a set of words is received accurately by the correct person. When Apex Airways leadership became aware of my identity, they did not apologize. They attempted to resolve the situation through financial compensation, offering me $750,000 via cashier's check, which I returned unopened. They initiated a campaign to identify sources inside the company speaking to journalists. They sent a cease and desist letter to a reporter whose story documented the 31 complaint pattern. And they appeared publicly to argue that I should be removed from this decision on grounds of personal bias. She reached into the folder. I am additionally in possession of an audio recording from an emergency Apex leadership meeting held the day after the incident. In that recording, Chief Operating Officer Richard Calloway instructs staff to charm her first to offer compensation in whatever material terms she will appreciate, and if those approaches fail, to go after her credibility and get her pulled from the decision entirely. His stated priority: make this problem go away. The gallery had gone completely still. Calloway's hands, visible on the table, were flat and motionless. Pierce did not look at him. I have submitted the full recording and transcript to this board through the appropriate secure channels as part of my official recommendation. She turned another page. My recommendation to this board is a conditional approval. Apex Airways may receive $4.8 billion in federal infrastructure funding subject to the following mandatory requirements. She read each one. Clearly, without haste. First, immediate termination of Frank DeLuca, with no severance package and no professional reference, and submission of his record to the Federal Aviation Consumer Protection Database for discriminatory conduct. Second, termination or formal reassignment of Richard Calloway from any customer-facing or federal relations function based on the recorded evidence of attempted interference with this federal review process. Third, establishment of an independent customer complaint oversight board with rotating membership not controlled by Apex management, with quarterly public reporting on all complaints received, their categorization, and their resolution. Fourth, mandatory dignity and anti-bias training for all customer-facing employees across all Apex hubs. Third-party administered. Applicable regardless of seniority. Compliance verified by the independent board. Fifth, a compensation fund of $15 million for documented victims of discriminatory gate practices at Apex properties. No non-disclosure agreements. No conditions. Sixth, independent compliance audits at months 12 and 24. Failure to meet any requirement triggers a recall clause on the full loan amount with penalty interest. She closed the folder. Apex Airways may accept these conditions and receive $4.8 billion in federal funding, and the opportunity to address the failures that allowed this pattern to develop over years under multiple supervisory layers. Or they may decline and explain to 11,000 employees why the leadership team's decisions were worth more than their jobs. She stepped back from the microphone, walked back to her chair, sat down. The room was silent for 4 seconds, long enough for silence to mean something. Senator Marchetti turned toward the front row. Her voice was measured and precise. Mr. Pierce, does Apex Airways wish to respond? Douglas Pierce stood. He was 63 years old and had been CEO for 8 years, and he had the quality of someone who had survived a great many difficult rooms and understood the difference between the ones that required fighting and the ones that required something else entirely. He did not look at Richard Calloway. "Senator." His voice was hoarse at the edges, the way a voice gets when something heavy has been pressing against it. Apex Airways accepts the conditions as stated. Calloway did not move. He was looking at the table in front of him. The cameras had all of it anyway. Senator Marchetti nodded once. "This board will confirm receipt of the conditional approval and initiate the compliance monitoring process. We are adjourned." The gavel came down. The room emptied the way formal rooms empty after formal proceedings. Purposefully, in the specific controlled dispersal of people who are processing significant things and don't want to do it in the middle of a crowd. Richard Calloway was not with the Apex attorneys clustered around Douglas Pierce. He had stood up when the gavel fell and walked toward the side exit with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who needed to be somewhere other than where they were. Dominique came through the main doors into the wide marble corridor. She moved through a cluster of reporters with brief professional acknowledgement and continued toward the elevator. She was about to turn when she heard footsteps behind her that were intentional in a way that was different from the general noise of the corridor. She stopped, turned. Richard Calloway, alone. No attorneys, no communication staff. He stopped 3 feet from her. His face had the quality of someone who was dealing with several different things at once and was not doing it gracefully. The practiced composure that had carried him through 24 years in executive suites had developed in the past hour several visible cracks. "Miss Harlow, Mr. Calloway." He glanced down, looked back up. He seemed to be deciding where to start, which was the problem. He had not come with language prepared. He had come with something that didn't yet have language. "I didn't order Frank to do what he did at the gate," he said. "I want you to know that. That's not... I didn't send him out there with that intention." Dominique looked at him. The gold watch was quiet on her wrist. The corridor around them was moving, and she and Calloway were still. "I believe you," she said. He blinked. That was apparently not what he had expected to hear. "But what you just said is exactly the part you still don't understand," she continued. Her voice was level, not unkind, but with no softness in it either. You didn't have to order it. Frank DeLuca knew what was expected of him. He had known it for 19 years. He knew it because no one ever told him he was wrong. Because 31 complaints went into a file and came out closed. Because the company he worked for, when it had the opportunity to address a pattern, chose every single time to protect the operation over the people the operation was supposed to serve. She held eye contact through all of it. You didn't send him out there. You just built the world where his choices made sense to him. And then you went into a conference room and recorded yourself asking your staff to make the problem disappear. She paused. The problem was never me, Mr. Calloway. The problem was the 31 people before me who didn't have a business card for someone to pick up. Calloway said nothing. He had the look of a man who has received accurate information about himself and is in the first minutes of knowing what to do with it. It was not a comfortable look. It was not supposed to be. "I hope you use the time well," Dominique said. "The next version of this company is going to need people who understand what went wrong here. Not just what happened, what made it possible." She turned and walked toward the elevator. Calloway stood at the turning point of the corridor for a moment alone. Then he walked back the way he had come. The consequences came quickly, and they were clear, and they were real. Frank DeLuca's employment with Apex Airways ended the same day as the hearing before the afternoon was out. No severance, no professional reference. His record was submitted to the Federal Aviation Consumer Database for discriminatory conduct, which meant that any commercial carrier doing a standard background check would see it. 19 years at one company. One gate. 31 complaints he had decided didn't matter. They had mattered. The record reflected that now. Richard Calloway was gone within 48 hours. The resignation announcement used the standard language. Pursuing other opportunities, grateful for 24 years, wishing the company well. The audio recording from the emergency leadership meeting, excerpts of which had been formally submitted to the Infrastructure Board and made part of the public hearing record, would follow his name whenever anyone looked. He had said what he'd said in a room he thought was private on a recording made by someone who had decided she was tired of being part of what she was part of. That was the permanent fact of it. The 7 passengers from the courthouse steps were contacted by Apex's newly appointed compliance officer within 3 weeks of the hearing. All 7 accepted settlements from the $15 million compensation fund with no conditions, no non-disclosures, no requirement to stay quiet. Aisha Williams, 15, received a scholarship fund in addition to her personal settlement. She used part of it to visit her father in Philadelphia. She flew Apex. She sat in her assigned seat without incident because the person at the gate looked at her boarding pass and smiled and said, "Have a great flight," and meant it. Elena Vasquez was appointed to the Independent Customer Complaint Oversight Board, the first flight attendant ever to serve on such a body at a major carrier. The appointment was proposed by the board's independent nominating committee. Dominique had not suggested Elena's name. She had not needed to. The nominating committee had read Elena's on-the-record account in the Atlanta Journal and made the decision themselves. Sandra Oviedo's actions were formally classified as protected whistleblowing activity under federal law. Her position at Apex was secure, though she chose, 6 weeks after the hearing, to accept a position with the Federal Consumer Protection Office because she had decided she wanted her work to be directly about the things she had done in that coffee shop. The move cost her 3 years of pension vesting. She made the decision in about 4 minutes. The Independent Oversight Board held its first meeting in Atlanta on a Tuesday morning in late November. Their charter required them to publish their first quarterly report within 90 days. They published it in 81. 2 weeks after the federal hearing on a Saturday morning, Peggy Okafor drove from Raleigh to her daughter's house in Durham. She brought a coffee cake she had made herself because that was what she brought when she was coming to say something that mattered and wanted there to be something else to do with your hands. James Coleman was home. He was in the backyard with their youngest, throwing a tennis ball for the dog, when Peggy came around the side of the house. He saw her and waved. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the coffee cake and the dog underfoot, and Peggy's daughter moved diplomatically in and out of the room, giving them space that she recognized they might need. James had seen the footage. He had seen all of it. The video, the hearing coverage, the Carlos Rivera piece in the Atlanta Journal. He had read the piece twice on 2 different evenings because the first time through he had been reading it with the part of himself that was trying to understand what had happened, and the second time he had been reading it with the part of himself that it had actually happened to. Peggy poured coffee and cut the cake and waited. James wrapped both hands around his mug. He was looking at the table with the particular quality of someone who has been carrying something for long enough that they have forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. "I thought I was wrong," he said. "For 2 years, in the back of my mind. I knew what had happened. I knew it completely. But there was this other voice that said, maybe I'd misread it. Maybe I'd been too sensitive. Maybe, if I'd been dressed differently, or if I'd said something different." He stopped. Peggy said nothing. She let him have the pause. "And then I watched that hearing," he said. 31 complaints, 22 months. He looked up. "I was one of them. You were. Nobody told me that." "Nobody told you because nobody was looking yet," Peggy said. "Now they're looking. And now the record shows what happened and who was responsible and what's being done about it." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "You were never wrong, James, not for one single minute. You were just early." He sat with that for a long moment. The dog put its chin on his knee. He reached down and scratched its ear automatically. "Thank you for filming it," he finally said. "I know you probably didn't go to the airport thinking you were going to do that." "I went to the airport thinking I was going to see my grandchildren," Peggy said. "But I've been a teacher for 40 years. I know what injustice looks like when I see it, and I know that looking away doesn't make it stop." 3 months after the hearing. Charlotte Douglas International Airport. Early morning. Dominique came through TSA pre-check the same way she always did, quietly. Alone, the worn leather bag, no entourage, no announcement. The terminal had the specific feeling of airports at 6:30 a.m., the particular mixture of purpose and exhaustion that belonged to people who were going somewhere before most of the world had started its day. She walked through the terminal, past the coffee kiosks, past the newsstand, past the cluster of gate areas that ran along the B concourse. She turned down the C corridor, gate C22. The gate area was filling up for the morning bank of departures. Families with strollers navigating around rolling luggage. Business travelers who had done this so many times that the motions were automatic. A young man in a university sweatshirt sleeping with his head against the window glass. At the boarding podium, a young woman in an Apex uniform was scanning boarding passes for the first departing flight. Her name tag read Mariella, Apex Airways. She was perhaps 26 with dark hair and the alert attentiveness of someone who was new enough to the job to still be fully present in every transaction. Dominique joined the boarding line. When she reached the front, she held out her boarding pass. Mariella took it, scanned it, glanced at the screen, and handed it back. "Have a wonderful flight, Miss Harlow." A genuine smile. No pause before it. No look up and down before the smile. Dominique nodded. "Thank you." She walked onto the jet bridge. She paused at the threshold, the same threshold where Elena Vasquez had stood 3 months ago with 1 foot in and 1 foot out watching, and she looked at the walls. The Apex logo was still there, blue and silver, the same as it had always been. But below the logo, at roughly eye height, a small rectangular sign had been mounted. White background, Apex blue text, clean and simple. Every passenger, every seat, no exceptions. She didn't know when they had put it up. She hadn't been told. It might have been Douglas Pierce's decision, or the new COO's, or the compliance board's recommendation, or someone in the Charlotte hub who had read the quarterly report and decided to do something small and concrete. It didn't matter whose idea it was. It was there. She walked the rest of the jet bridge, boarded the aircraft, found seat 3A, and sat down. Stowed her bag, fastened her seatbelt. Through the oval window, she could see the runway, the approach lights blinking in sequence, a plane banking into final approach with its landing gear descending. The ordinary miracle of air travel doing what it was supposed to do, moving people from where they were to where they were going, predictably, safely, without anyone at a gate deciding whether they looked like someone who belonged. She looked at the watch. Her mother had worked 38 years in a profession that had tried more than once to make her feel like less than what she was. She had gone back every morning and done the work, and held the line, and never let them make her bitter. And at the end of it, she had left the world in the specific way that mattered better than she had found it. The cabin door closed. The engines deepened their hum. The aircraft began to move. The plane lifted from the runway at 7:21 a.m., climbing through the thin morning overcast into the blue above it. Dominique looked out the window as Charlotte fell away below. The grid of roads, the glint of the airport, the particular geography of a place where something had happened that had mattered in ways she was still probably not done understanding. She looked at the watch. The second hand turned. The gold plate was worn. The crystal was scratched. The mechanism inside kept perfect time, the same as it always had, the same as it had through 38 years. And all the mornings that watch had started, and all the nights it had ended, and the one morning 3 years ago when it had moved from one wrist to another and kept going. Don't let them make you bitter, baby. That's how they win. She had not been bitter. She had been precise. She had documented and filed and built a framework, and stood at a microphone and read 6 conditions into the federal record, and then walked back to her chair. She had not taken revenge. She had delivered accountability with architecture, which was not the same thing, and was significantly harder to do and significantly more likely to last. The clouds broke around the aircraft as it climbed. Light filled the cabin from both sides. She closed her eyes. Not from exhaustion, from something that had less to do with tired and more to do with stillness. The particular stillness that follows a long effort done cleanly and honestly and for the right reasons. She didn't win because she had power. She won because she understood the difference between power and dignity. Power can be taken, borrowed, inherited, stripped away when someone with more of it decides you shouldn't have it. Dignity is the other thing. The thing her mother carried in nursing shoes through 40 years of night shifts. The thing that couldn't be revoked by a gate agent's hand gesture or a voicemail offer or a legal strategy built around making someone doubt what they clearly saw. That was the inheritance. Not money, not position. The posture, the practice. The daily choice to remember exactly who you are, especially on the hard days. For every person who will ever sit in seat 3A after her, the world is a fraction more fair than it was the morning Frank DeLuca decided she didn't belong. That fraction is everything. If this story moved you, if you felt something watching Dominique stand her ground with nothing but dignity and precision, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Not for the algorithm. For the person who has ever been made to feel like they didn't belong somewhere they had every right to be. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it right now. Hit that like button too. It helps more people find stories like this one. We tell these stories because the people in them deserve to be heard, and because every single one of us has felt at some point like someone decided we didn't fit before we even got the chance to show who we were. Dominique Harlow didn't need anyone to rescue her. She knew exactly who she was. She had learned it at a kitchen table at 3 a.m. from a woman in nursing shoes who had decided a long time ago that she would not let the world make her small. That lesson carried forward. It always does. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. We'll see you in the next one.